Tips with Toni. Tips with Toni. All about nutrition from your favorite dietitian. Everything you need to digest in your mind. Tips with Toni. Tips with Toni. Making you healthier one bite at a time. Tip with Toni. Woo.
Hello, and welcome to the Tips with Toni podcast. I'm Toni Marinucci, your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time. This next interview is with Dr. Vincent Esposito, who is a functional medicine doctor, once chiropractor, now helping you to identify the underlying factors causing chronic illnesses. He helps people with weight loss issues, hormonal imbalances, thyroid dysfunction, autoimmune disorders, digestive disorders, heart disease, diabetes, and fibromyalgia. Today, we are talking all about gut health, identifying food sensitivities. Should you take a probiotic? If so, how much or what should that source be coming from? And learning all about how to make food fun again. Without further ado, here is the interview with Dr. Vincent Esposito. Enjoy. Hi, Dr. Esposito. How are you?
Hi, Toni. I'm doing great. How are you today? Thanks for having me on.
I'm doing great. I'm excited to have you. Really excited to learn from you. I always like to begin the podcast always asking you to introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and most importantly, why you do what you do.
Sure. So my name's Dr. Vincent Esposito. I am a chiropractor. I do a lot of work in the functional nutrition realm. And that is basically where I get started. That's where I spend most of my time. I write blogs about it. We have our own podcast, The Art of Eating, which we talk about a lot of the stuff I'm sure we're going to talk about today. And yeah, just like getting the information out there as much as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that you started out as a chiropractor, but then you kind of transitioned more to functional medicine. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about that and kind of maybe why you made that shift.
Yeah, so it's an interesting story, actually. So I grew up in Queens. Both my parents are from Brooklyn, from Italian-American families, more or less. So I was around the kitchen a lot growing up. My mom did most of the cooking, well, basically all the cooking. And I never really did it on my own, but we ate, I would say, relatively healthy for most of my life up until I went to college. And when I went to college, I ended up, probably by my senior year, I ended up putting on maybe 20, 25 pounds or so since high school. I was playing sports. I played baseball in college. So I figured a lot of it was just kind of muscle or something like that. And I never really cooked before, still hadn't at that point. And we kind of always used to joke how like the college food was so bad and it would kind of run right through you. And I didn't really think much of it. But as school went on, along with the weight gain, I started getting a lot of kind of digestive issues I never had before, whether was like diarrhea, bloating, just kind of feeling generally not necessarily unwell, but I guess uneasy, like less comfortable on a day-to-day basis. And I didn't really know what was going on. But at the time, I wanted to become a chiropractor because I worked in the varsity gym essentially with all the college teams, and I was really into rehab. So I went to chiropractic school. I started that next summer, and I got really into the biochemistry aspect of it. We learned a lot of biochem, but how it related to what we ate and kind of external stimuli was really interesting to me. So that kind of triggered me to start my master's concurrently while I was there. And I ended up getting my master's in human nutrition while I was there as well. Now, at the same time, after I graduated, I was living by myself for the first time, which means I had to finally teach myself how to cook. So again, coming from, kind of more of a Italian-American background, like the first thing I taught myself how to do was boil pasta and learn a lot of those kind of basic dishes that were not necessarily great for you, but again, it was just kind of what I was around. So that was the first thing. Those were the first things I learned in my introduction into the kitchen. And that was the majority of how it was for the first 2 years. And for those first 2 years, I still had a lot of those same issues that from college had the same problems. They weren't going away. Still had the weight on. I didn't think it was much of an issue. I was still very active. I was, in the gym or working out somewhere between 5 and 6 days a week. But the weight stayed on. I was still having those digestive issues. And it wasn't until I got further along in my master's, I was like, all right, something has to change. And I'm going to be my first kind of test subject, which is, I feel how a lot of people who end up getting into this is how it starts.
Yeah, I feel like I'm listening to my story right now.
Yeah. So, all right, I figure I'm learning about this stuff. I obviously find it very interesting. It's time to put it to the test. So I started cutting a lot of stuff out that I had. I was never a big dairy person, so that was very easy to get rid of, which is usually the hardest thing for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the pastas, the simple carbohydrates, I got a lot more vegetables in on a daily basis, more a couple times a day. I played around with intermittent fasting from time to time. And within the first, I want to say, about month or so, a lot of the digestive issues kind of went away. And over the first 3-4 months, that extra weight I put on kind of came off. So about 3 months to 4 months later, I was back down to what I was basically in high school. And I felt a lot better. So I was like, okay, at this point, I'm almost done with chiropractic school, maybe like a year or so left. This is where I was like, this is what I want to do for a living. And I wanted to get more into, listen, if you can take, just make changes in your own life. And if you have maybe a little bit of a direction or you need a push or don't know where to start, I kind of want to be that catalyst, because a lot of these things are preventable and even reversible if you just kind of have the tools at your disposal. And for me, it just took time teaching myself how to cook and planning things out accordingly to get to where I did. And ultimately, by the time I ended up graduating chiropractic school, that wasn't my focus anymore. It was getting into, nutrition and functional nutrition, helping people make the daily changes. And that's kind of how I got into it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that a lot. So what was the time frame? Just to put this into perspective for people that we can learn how to cook and change your health in like a day. What was the time frame where that was the whole process going for you?
So that's
making the changes and then like finally feeling like, okay,
absolutely. So that's actually a really good point. And I will start by saying, so my chiropractic school was 4 years. I would say the first year and a half or so, again, I didn't really have anyone teaching me. I would call maybe my mom from time to time for like little tips and whatnot, but I basically taught myself kind of how to cook from scratch. So a lot of it was literally learning how an oven turns on, the difference between an electric and gas stove, like very little minute things you might not necessarily think about, and just kind of getting basics down. Mm-hmm. Probably around, I'd say like 18 months to 2 years was when I I figured out kind of how to cook, how to meal prep, how to keep myself on a schedule and how to make my meals in a time efficient manner. Mm-hmm. And that was around the time I was like, okay, I need to start making the changes. I need to start cutting out a lot of the foods I talked about before. Mm-hmm. And since I got the basics down, it was simply just getting rid of things in the pantry, introducing new things. So that really was probably only about 4 or 5 months after teaching myself the basics, which took, maybe a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Like we need a foundation first, mm-hmm. and you need to develop like the fundamental things first. And then once you do that, it really is a lot easier to just like add things on or whatever. So I think that's really, really awesome. And that's really cool. And you're not alone. I'll never forget when I was in school to be a dietetics major. I was a dietetics major. I was in school to become a dietitian. And we took like cooking classes as part of our major.
I wish I did.
We had to, because part of a dietitian, you can also manage kitchens. And so mm-hmm. you need to know about food safety and food science and stuff like that. And I'll never forget, I was in a group of 4, and it was two girls and 2 guys. And we were like, all right, like we had to make pasta and brownies or something. So we're like, all right, mm-hmm. let's give the guys the pasta. Like that's easy. We'll take care of the brownies. Like we had to do like a healthy brownie or whatever. And I look over and one of my friends, he puts the pasta in water before it was like, it didn't boil. Like you just put it in and I'm like,
Yeah.
I was like, you can never assume but if you're right though, like if no one ever taught you the basics, like how are you going to know? It seems so simple, and it is simple, but it needs to be broken down and it needs to be shown. And then from there it is easier.
Right. And I do think, and this is actually something that I think is really important to understand, it doesn't have to take as long as it took me to like learn how to cook. You can do it if you kind of put your mind to it in a couple months to kind of get a feel of how your kitchen works. Because at the end of the day, there's really only, I'd say 5 or 6 basic skills you need to learn in terms of how to cook dishes, whether it's, roasting or baking, to stir frying, to chopping properly, to sauteing. There's not that many different ways you can cook things. It just becomes a way, becoming comfortable with ingredients, maybe how long they would take to cook, and maybe steps in terms of adding flavor and stuff like that. But the actual steps, there's only about I think 5 or 6 basic skills you need to learn to get proficient. And I think that's really important. So if you're willing to kind of take the time and learn those few skills, like how to roast, how to bake things, how to saute, how to chop properly, those are the basics you really need. And then from there, it's just kind of getting creative. And that's something I really encourage, is to be creative and fun and add different flavors to things, because that's really is what's going to keep you motivated going forward, is to create new things going along. Yeah.
And I mean, we all have to eat to live, right? So
absolutely,
it's a skill you need. It's not like, you have to learn. And I think what you've learned from your experience of trying to do it on your own, it's why you do what you do now, is to help people to expedite the process, right?
Right, exactly.
I have a program because I did it on my own too. I was the dietetics major. I was supposed to figure it out. I was supposed to know how to do it. So I never got the help. And then it took me so much longer to, fix my problems if I would have just reached out sooner. And it's what leads us to do what we do today.
Right.
But one thing that I really love is your podcast in general, like called The Art of Eating. And I love that you give like specific examples that people can apply or buy. Like if they want some type of a snack, they can go and purchase. You don't always have to make some of these foods. Like, yes, it's important to know how to cook, but there are foods you can purchase
absolutely
that are still just as healthy as if you were to make it at home.
Right.
So that's really what I love. So can you talk more about your podcast? Because I think a lot of my listeners would appreciate some of the tips you give in there.
Sure. So it's called The Art of Eating. It started by myself and my friend, Dr. Callie Olson. We're co-hosts. Our goal was, we've both been into podcasts for a while, but most of the ones that are kind of nutrition related are either heavy science based or kind of basic. We wanted to find a middle ground where we can teach people, the basics of why maybe certain conditions happen and what therapies you can maybe do at home or certain things to look for. But at the same time, what we really try to do is give you guys realistic, approachable strategies that anyone can really do at home. Again, it's just finding that right direction. So the goal of the podcast for us is really to give people that direction, or at least know where to start looking. So one thing we do, like you noted, we started that maybe about 8, 9, 10 episodes in. We started giving recipes of things we would make during the week, just so other people have ideas, because sometimes it's having the idea to get started. So we figured sharing some of the things we do could be that spark a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I think application is everything, right? So you can listen to all the podcasts in the world. You can watch all the YouTube videos. You can follow all the best people on Instagram. But until you actually apply it to your lifestyle, how is it going to stay true? And I think you guys provide ways to make it easy and take kind of like, when you're first trying anything new, there's a lot of hesitation and fear.
100%.
And you don't know which direction you're going in. And I think you help create clarity.
Yes. That's at least the goal.
Yeah.
Try to make it clear.
Great. I'm going to put it in the show notes so anybody who wants to go and listen to your episodes, like they can subscribe.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be fantastic.
I'll put it in there along with like your Instagram information and stuff.
Sure.
But circling back a little bit,
yep.
You explained, you said how you were experiencing a lot of bloating and stuff. And so I know that bloating comes up with like almost all my clients, or like every conversation I have with someone. Personally, I'm someone who's had bloating most of my life. And so I'm wondering from you, like, did you find out that you had like an intolerance or a sensitivity with people that you work with? Have you been noticing bloating is happening more? And like, if so, why? Like, what do you think is happening there? I know I asked like a few questions in one.
Yeah. So I'll try to break it down one by one. So for me personally, I actually never got any specific testing. I do notice more so now, and it's rare I do have it, but whether there's maybe cheese in something, I do notice it, not necessarily immediately, but maybe either the next day or hours on later in the day. In terms of specific sensitivities, I never really got tested. I just noted how I would generally be feeling. So I wouldn't necessarily call it tiredness, but there was definitely some brain fog, or I'd be a little bit more kind of all over the place mentally, maybe not as sharp in terms of focusing. So that was definitely something with me. Those were probably the main thing, and just generally just not feeling as upbeat and energetic. I think those were probably the major things I felt. Now, I didn't have any testing, but what I did notice is when I started cutting these things out, I seemed to be a lot clearer. I seemed to be able to focus better. I seemed to be not as tired, especially in the latter end of the day. And that's kind of how I judged it. I never really got the blood testing because I was in school and it was crazy. So I never actually got the testing. But even now, when I tell people when they get testing, at the end of the day, you know yourself better than any doctor can or anyone you work with can, because you know how you feel. So it's really important. And this is something I tell all my patients, clients, whoever, is it's really important to keep a food diary, because a lot of the times if you happen to be sensitive to a certain food, you might not feel anything from anywhere between 24 to 72 hours. That's 3 days later, you might be feeling something. So unless you can backtrack and trace your steps, it's going to be really tough to nail down is, food X, Y, or Z potentially causing something going on. The second part of that was, why is bloating more prevalent?
Why do you think it's so prevalent nowadays?
So bloating's tricky if you're looking at it in isolation, because it's a very kind of generic symptom, right? So it could be associated with a bunch of different things. So most of the time, I'd say some of the top reasons that bloating might be happening is some sort of digestive issue you have going on. We're talking about, irritable bowel syndrome, IBD, maybe ulcerative colitis could be an issue. Food allergies or sensitivities, you brought that up. Those could be a major player in terms of bloating. It could be a SIBO infection, which I think we're going to get to later, so I don't want to get to that. And it could be hormonal changes too. So there's a bunch of different reasons you might get bloating, but it's really tough to say one thing is causing bloating without more information on its own. But it is important to track. Like I said, I think with the food diary, it's to note, okay, maybe I had something that might have had dairy in it, or gluten, which are big ones, or even, processed soy, something like that. And it's really important to track it so okay, maybe it could be this, and I could check it down the road. So that's, I think, a really important thing when it comes to bloating in particular.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it when you said, food diary, it's like all I preach about. It's just so important. If you know better, you'll do better. And so not only does it bring awareness to your food choices, but it also will pinpoint things that might be happening, like bloating or whatever. It also individualizes the plan, because even if you do get tested, you're right. Like, there's so many food sensitivity tests out there that will say you're like sensitive to everything. And it's just like, well, you're not going to exclude everything, especially a lot of the nutrient dense foods. It's always to a certain scale. And one thing, I actually have an IGTV post coming out later today. And it's all about how actually, like, during times of when we're super stressed out, I
didn't even get to that. Yeah, sleep and stress are huge things too.
Stress is like a huge component, right? So like, you could be sensitive to dairy. Let's use that as primary, very common example. And normally it makes you bloat, but you could be on vacation and just like loving life and not stressed at all. You haven't thought of a fear in the world or anything, and you could eat dairy and be fine.
Yep.
So it's very individualized, and like you said, it's so multifactorial. Like there's a lot of things that could be causing that bloat.
Yeah. So a couple of things though before we move on. So one thing is, if you are going to get a food sensitivity panel, unfortunately, it's really tough to gauge which one you might get, because sometimes, a lot of times, depending on where you get it, it might just come back you're sensitive to foods you might eat often.
Yeah.
So it's really tough to gauge that on its own using a test. However, there is one company, unfortunately, I'm out in New York, so I don't have access to Cyrex, but they run a really good food sensitivity panel that seems to be more accurate and specific based on what you have going on. So if you're out in New York, that's a great test if you work with a provider to ask if you really want that kind of objective data. The other thing about the food diary, which is really important, and just from our end being practitioners, because we're not with, our patients and clients every day, and we can't be with them literally 24/7, it is important to track it on your own, because unless there either is objective data or you're tracking it, it's going to be very hard for us to blanket say, oh, it's this food or that food, without at least something going on or some measure you're using to track what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about, elimination diets and getting into that too, and that might be a good place to start. But again, unless you're sticking with it and tracking what you're doing from the practitioner's end, it's going to be tough to make modifications or make it individualized if we don't have information to go off. And that's really important.
It's so important. And it's why it's so advised to not only to obviously work with a practitioner or a health professional, because they're going to help relieve a lot of that stress and anxiety and give you, good swaps and alternatives and help you through the process of like not having all the foods you used to love and enjoy. Mm-hmm. But also, like you said, the consistency is key, because unless you're consistently eating the same foods or not, or whatever, we have nothing to track.
Right.
So it's so hard when your diet's all over the place. Mm-hmm. It's impossible, literally almost impossible to pinpoint. But if you're consistently eating the same foods every day, it's a lot easier for us to circle back and see like, okay, this is most likely the problem. And then like give them tips on how to, either prevent the symptoms or treat the symptoms, whatever's going on.
100%. Totally agree.
So going towards like kind of treatment, I know a lot of professionals or non-professionals, people who just see things on the internet, will like hear, okay, someone's bloated, let's give them a probiotic. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on probiotics? Let's just go there. Let's talk probiotics.
Yeah, so probiotics are great. Again, there's going to be some caveats. I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute. But for me, one of the things that stuck out to me when I was learning about the gut, how it functions and things like that, is that 90% of the cells inside our body are actually non-human cells, which means they're either bacteria or microbes that live in our gut. So we are outnumbered literally 9-1, non-human cells to human cells. Mm-hmm. So when you think about it that way, and now with a lot more information out there on gut-brain connection, how gut health can affect mood and general well-being, and obviously we talked about leaky gut and other things like that, the gut bacteria kind of play a role. So my analogy I use is when you're taking freshman biology or 7th or 8th grade biology. Remember, you learn the biomes, the desert, the Arctic, the forest. Essentially, the gut is its own biome. So certain bacteria strains can dominate or be pushed to the side depending on the environment. And the environment is dictated essentially by how we eat, how we sleep, stress levels, how active you are. All the different lifestyle factors actually play a role in how that biome, that microbiome is built, is made. A lot of times, especially with gut issues, that balance is altered. So certain what are known as opportunistic bacteria get an opportunity to seize control of part of the gut that maybe they wouldn't have before. And it could be leading to some of those symptoms, including bloating. That is why probiotics can be helpful, because it basically, you introduce some of those good bacteria strains. Usually the most common you could find now are lactobacillus or bifidobacteria, and there's different genus and species, but not for now.
Part 2.
Yes, you can introduce those back into the gut to help get back to that homeostasis and bring it back to get rid of those opportunistic strains and bring more of the good, quote unquote, bacteria back into the gut. So that's kind of the idea behind probiotics in a nutshell.
Yeah. I definitely think the science hasn't caught up yet. I think like it's starting to, but I do believe like introducing probiotics into the diet is going to show like everything we just spoke about, like, and some. That's my prediction. I think it's going to show that there's a huge benefit to introducing probiotics. Now, do you believe in supplements or food form or both? Where are you on that?
Yeah, so it could be both. It's really going to depend on what's going on. It could be a situation where you might want to go with a certain probiotic strain or not, depending on the symptom. For example, I'd mentioned bifidobacteria, lactobacillus. If you say have SIBO, for instance, you might not be able to handle those strains because there's already an overgrowth. So you might need to go a different direction.
Yeah.
My general plan, plan when it comes to supplements in general is if you're not willing to at least start and making the dietary changes, supplements in general are not going to fix the problem on their own, no matter what your problem is. You have to be willing to start and promote that growth. So especially with probiotics, if you're going to still eat, the processed foods, the extra sugars, add in the creamer and sweetener to your coffee every morning, things like that, those same bacteria that you just added are just going to get taken over again. You have to set up and literally build an environment where they can thrive. So a couple things need to go on. You would need to have prebiotics in terms of food. And those are generally high fiber foods. So you see that a lot in your vegetables, things like asparagus, endive, lettuces, leafy green vegetables. You're going to get a lot of prebiotics in those. And those are great because they essentially provide the fuel for the good bacteria to survive. Right. Whereas the processed sugars and things of that nature, the bad strains tend to eat those up first, and that's why they're able to thrive in those environments. And so when it comes back to probiotics, you can either supplement or introduce probiotic foods. Generally, depends on where you are on the spectrum in terms of how bad is it, depending on test results, depending on how you feel. It could be introducing a probiotic. It could be just doing the foods. It could be both, depending on where you are, what you like, things of that nature. I like to start with the foods. And for them, we're talking about fermented foods. So things like sauerkraut, pickles, kimchi, it could go on down the list. There's tempeh if you want a fermented product like that. So there's a ton of fermented vegetables out there. You can make them at home if you want. It's not that hard to do. Yogurts are great. So miso, there's a bunch of foods out there that can help introduce probiotic strains. I would start with those unless there's something either specific for probiotic supplementation or they just, for whatever reason, don't want those foods. That would kind of be my at least initial step most of the time. Yeah.
Usually it's food first. It's always a good recommendation. And supplements, like you said, it's always like you have to have the foundations first as well. But even so, supplements are you should be working with a healthcare professional to really tell you how much, or if so, or like you said, that's actually a good point. There are certain cases where you could be experiencing bloating, but the diagnosis could be something like SIBO, which I want you to talk about in a minute. And then taking certain probiotics at that time could actually make it worse. So with supplements, it's always ask a professional before you start a supplement, especially because supplements are not regulated by the FDA.
Yes.
So certain ones out there could say they have all these probiotics and they've never been tested in there and you're just wasting your money.
Yeah. So a couple notes on that. One, I totally agree. You should work with, a provider who knows what they're doing or has access to a professional grade supplement. So a couple of things, one general and then one specific to probiotics. So if you are going to buy a supplement, I would absolutely recommend working with a practitioner who knows what they're talking about or has access to professional grade products. The reason being is there are third-party companies like that incorporate current good manufacturing practices, which essentially is a third-party company that ensures this product has the ingredients that it says it has, which is a huge issue in the supplement realm to begin with. So you want to make sure at least you see that GMP seal on whatever supplement you're buying. And the second part, when it comes to probiotics, is you have to understand we're dealing with living organisms. They're, for most of the part, they're bacteria. They could be yeast, depending on what you get. So they need to be stored properly, which means generally they're refrigerated, and they need to stay refrigerated once you open them because they will die over time. So if they're not stored and used properly, they're not going to be as effective. And that's really important when it comes to, usage and storage and knowing where it comes from. So I really harp on this. This isn't, to promote other healthcare professionals on they have better stuff, but a lot of the times that is the case because, like you said, the FDA does it. It's a really hard because it's not a very regulated industry as a whole. So if you're not getting professional grade products and working with the provider in terms of how and when to use certain products, you're probably not going to get the best from it. And that's really important.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I agree.
No problem.
So just because we touched on it, I don't want to skip over SIBO. I think a lot of people are hearing about it, but they might not be clear about what does SIBO stand for and what is it?
Okay, so SIBO's an interesting thing. So it stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So sounds like a mouthful, but you could break it down fairly simply. So most of the bacteria found in the gut is actually in the large intestine. And what separates the large intestine from the small intestine is a valve known as the ileocecal valve. Now, for a variety of reasons, that valve could malfunction or open from time to time when it probably shouldn't, and it gives opportunistic bacteria a chance to inhabit the small intestine where under normal circumstances they wouldn't. So that is essentially what happens. These bacteria get from the large intestine into the small intestine, and then from there, it could cause a variety of different symptoms, most of which we talked about before, whether it's, food allergies or sensitivities, IBS, all things like that. And that's how it starts. So that's really how it gets there, essentially.
Yeah.
Or it can get there a variety of ways, but that's the pathogenesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, how would you know if you have SIBO? I actually have the test right here. I'm not going to lie. I don't think I have it, but I found out I have mono, but for a while I didn't know what was happening. So I got tested for everything. I already bought the test.
All right.
But let's talk about that. How a lot of these things usually aren't covered by insurance, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Their home test, So how would one test for SIBO?
So there are a couple tests you can do, and I want to get to the major one at the end. So there are stool analyses you can do that will kind of tell you if there is a lack of diversity in bacteria. However, that's not necessarily diagnostic of SIBO on its own. It could just be something to tell you that microbiome, there's something off in it. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you get a blood test, if you test for C-reactive protein, if you test for homocysteine, these are markers for general inflammation.
Yeah. No.
Again, not necessarily diagnostic on their own of SIBO, but they can play a role in terms of saying what else is going on.
Exactly.
Now, the most diagnostic test is actually the SIBO breath test, which is a test you do at home.
I have. I'm going to show the video because I don't know when this video is coming out, but just for when people want to see.
Yeah. And generally, all the tests are slightly different. But what happens is you take a glucose mixture, or you mix this glucose packet with water, you drink it, and after fasting overnight, usually.
Yeah.
You drink it, and then depending on the test, 15, 20 minutes, you essentially blow into a test tube and you cap it, and you do that for about 3 to 4 hours, again, depending on the test. You ship out the 10 to 12 to 15 test tubes you have to the lab, and then they get back to you within 3-4 weeks telling you what's going on. Now, the idea is you essentially drink just sugar water, and what it tracks is where that glucose is getting broken down. If it happens to be getting broken down early on or in the small intestine, that could be a trigger of SIBO, because that's not necessarily where that's supposed to happen. That means there's those bacteria that can ferment can ferment those sugars, ended up where they aren't supposed to be, and that is indicative of what SIBO is.
Yeah. And I will just say, just because, listen, I, as a nutrition professional, whatever, I totally took the test and they couldn't read my sample. So, anybody listening, this is number 2.
Oh, no.
Luckily, I got them to ship it to me and I didn't have to pay twice. However, I'm now, before I take it again this time, it's actually been here for a little bit because I feel like I need to really seriously do it this time.
Yeah.
Watch their YouTube videos on it. I'm going to call the place before. I'm going to make sure they explain it to me in great detail so that I don't have to fast again. So I don't have to go through the inconvenience of like, okay, I need to be home because I have to do this every 2 hours, but whatever. Read the directions in full.
Yes. This is not a test you would want to do again, because it not only affects the day of, it generally affects the day before too.
Yeah.
So you really have to prep ahead of time. It's really like a 48-hour process at the end of the day.
Annoying, so.
Yeah. And honestly, it's just annoying. So while it is it's a very helpful diagnostic tool,
I really need to do it.
Yeah, it is something, unfortunately, you have to do at home. And it is something that, it is a little painstaking, but it is helpful if you might have SIBO. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's cool that like, I like what you said earlier, the other tests it's like showing you that something's going on, but it's not like, okay, this is what it is.
It's not specific to SIBO, correct?
This is specific. And I think like anything, like obviously improving your diet, working with a professional, we can get you so far. But without a root cause, it's a lot of guess and check. And it's a lot easier to implement something when we know exactly what's going on.
Exactly.
So
that's very well put.
Yeah. And so, I mean, quickly, just because I know we're running a little bit out of time, but like if someone finds out they have SIBO, what would be the steps they would need to take to heal it?
Sure. So SIBO, unfortunately, is probably one of the more annoying things to treat, because a lot of it is actually going to go, a lot of it is based on, how well are you going to stick to the guidelines? So one of the big things when it comes to treating SIBO is something known as a low FODMAPs diet. It's a long acronym that stands for essentially things that these bacteria can ferment. So the goal is to implement this diet. You're going to essentially take out all these foods that the overgrown bacteria ferment normally. And the idea is to essentially starve those bacteria out. Now, this is not an easy diet to follow.
Not at all.
And it is also something you're going to have to do for at least a month, more likely closer to 2+.
Yeah.
It is not
at least 6 weeks.
Yeah. So, you're really lucky if it's under a month, and you're cutting out a lot of usually high starchy things. Unfortunately, it gets to some vegetables. So it's really important, if you're going to do this, get a list.
Yeah.
There's no way I'm going to cover all of it right now. But there is a list of certain things you can do and can't. There's a couple things you can do to help with SIBO from a supplement perspective. One thing I tend to notice in those with SIBO is they tend to have low stomach acid levels. That's actually one of the reasons why it comes up to begin with. So if you have been eating poorly, if you happen to take, antacids or like Pepcid or something like that, or Tums, they lower stomach acid long term. We talked about putting a Band-Aid on the problem. That is a huge thing with them.
Thank you. I'm really happy. Can you just repeat that? Because I think a lot of people do this.
Yes.
My sister, I love her to death.
Well,
she's one of them. So what's the problem with using something like Tums repeatedly?
Okay, so now, so we need an adequate amount of stomach acid to essentially break food down properly. Now, for whatever reason, if you can't break it down, you tend to get that indigestion, that reflux, GERD, essentially, something like that. And to calm that down, many times the first action it would be to take an antacid or something like Tums or Pepcid, like I mentioned, which essentially it raises the pH, which means it lowers the stomach acid levels in the stomach. So while it lowers the stomach acid and relieves the symptoms short term, if you constantly do it for, a week, 2 weeks down, and people do it for months and years, it reduces your stomach's ability to produce adequate amounts of stomach acid to begin with. So it becomes essentially a spiral downwards. Right. Now, unfortunately, the root of the problem is you don't have enough stomach acid to begin with. And if you do not have enough stomach acid, the lower esophageal sphincter, which allows the reflux to happen, never closes. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, you don't digest foods properly. Foods aren't broken down to a level where they should be, especially proteins in the stomach, to the level they should be because you don't have enough stomach acid. So what's really important would be to take a stomach acid supplement while you eat. It's a process, again, I would suggest working with someone doing because it's going to be how you respond to it. So it could be someone needs to take 4 or 5 pills to get started. It could be taking 1 or 2. And you're really going to take them until you feel kind of a warmth sensation right before you eat. And kind of as it improves, you'll notice you'll need to take less. Now, a couple things when it comes to stomach acid, I mentioned the GERD, but on the other end, when the food goes into the intestines, the acidity of the chyme of essentially all that broken down food is the trigger for bile release, for pancreatic enzyme release. So if the stomach acid is not an adequate amount, you're not releasing enough of those enzymes to break down the carbohydrates, the fats, and the rest of the proteins too. So this leads to a lot of indigested food, which ultimately those bacteria get their hands on because it's not broken down and absorbed properly. And this tends to be an issue with a lot of gut things, not necessarily just SIBO, but IBS, food sensitivities. A lot of it comes down to a lot of low stomach acid conditions. It's really common, and it tends to play. It's kind of the trigger for a lot of the digestive process after the stomach. So it's really important to address that if that's a thing.
Yeah. And so one thing I've learned, actually, I implement is just drinking lemon water to replace the acid. What other things would you recommend for someone who suspects they have low stomach acid?
So apple cider vinegar, I would use in a similar way. You can do it in water also. You can take it as a shot if you're adventurous. It's very strong. Yeah. I would do that. Same thing with the lemon water, probably 10, 15 minutes before you eat. Mm-hmm. The nice part I do like about the supplements is it's a lot easier to track dosage, and you can go high and more importantly kind of scale down as it improves. Mm-hmm. That's really again, I wouldn't suggest doing it on your own. I would suggest working with someone and someone you can keep in track, because that is something that could be in flux. But if you're going to do it at home, I would say the lemon water, apple cider vinegar, I think is really good too.
Great. Mm-hmm. Great. And just to I just always feel like I need to kind of throw in, you hear things like apple cider vinegar is like the end all and cure all, and it's like applied to everything in life. And we know that there's benefits to it, but you have to, once again, work on the nutrition.
Yes.
And then using something like apple cider vinegar or lemon water can be a great help, an additive, and something that can assist. But don't let that, don't end it. I don't want anyone walking away from this conversation being like, oh, I'm just going to drink all the apple cider vinegar and just forget about everything else I learned in the podcast.
That's an awesome point, because really, again, if you're not changing what you're doing along the way, those same problems aren't going to go away. Again, even we're noticing that with a lot of prescription drugs too, like they're not going to work if you're not going to make the lifestyle changes along with it. So the supplements are not going to cure the problem on their own. You need to be willing to make the changes, and more importantly, work with someone over time who's willing to, help and guide, and someone you can ask questions, because these aren't things that change overnight. Mm-hmm. There are lifestyle changes, but more importantly, if you do have something, like SIBO or bloating, chances are it didn't happen overnight either. So you have to, if it took something, years to develop, it's going to take a while to bring it back down to baseline and normal. So you have to be patient with it. I think it's really important to look at the process as a journey as a whole and kind of enjoy it. Like make cooking a hobby. That's kind of what I did. And kind of a lot of what my Instagram was, I'm going to try to transition from showing just food I make from now on. But that was the initial goal, is to be like, listen, like this is just stuff I taught myself how to do. Like anyone can do it. It's just, just try and mess up. I mess up all the time.
That's failure is feedback, and it's not failure if you learn from it.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So Dr. Esposito, you've been absolutely wonderful. Where can people find you?
Sure. So anyone can reach me via email. I'm very responsive to that. So my email is dr and then my name, Vincent Esposito. So Dr. Vincent Esposito @gmail. I am on Instagram at Inside Out HANDW. So it's HNW. We do have a new website now that hosts our podcast. So it's called Evoke Health, evokhealth.com, where we have our podcast. And we just launched a series actually of online courses that were designed to kind of help people to kickstart the cooking process, learn the basics of it, to understand, what to look for when you have, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, to understand what you're looking for when you're shopping. We have shopping lists. We have an ebook on there, and they're all meant to kind of help along the process. Because I've noticed in my experience in practice, I know even the hour I spend with a patient initially is not necessarily enough. And even the follow-ups, every biweekly or monthly, I know the day-to-day stuff is the hardest stuff. So the people I do work with have access to me via email and text on a daily basis. So if they have questions, I get, hey, I get pictures of the label. Hey, is this good? Hey, is this not good? And I know that's the stuff that's actually hard, is what the hell am I looking for?
Totally.
And I think it's nice to have that resource. So that's what I try to do with my patients. We try to make that easy in the courses, and so that's kind of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I will definitely put all that in the show notes. If you want to maybe email me that stuff.
Yeah, no problem.
I can just copy and paste. It'll be a lot easier.
No problem. I can do that.
Yeah. And so do you see people, you're in New York, correct?
In Brooklyn and Manhattan. I'm in a couple different offices, and I take clients virtually.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I just wanted to know. Okay, cool. Yeah. Awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to add or talk about that we didn't get to today?
Well, I think the last thing, like we said, we talked about a couple of different strategies, and while they are helpful, again, I really think it's important that if you are going to make these lifestyle changes, whether you like it or not, it's really going to start in the kitchen, and you have to be willing to some extent to learn and make some time. I mean, I think once you get the hang of it, it becomes really empowering. It did for me. It kind of gave me a lot more flexibility and creativity. And that was really the basics. So while I did have, a couple supplements going on at the time, it really wasn't until I made the differences consistently and be patient with it. It's going to take maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months. It could take half a year. It could take longer depending on what's going on. But there needs to be that initial commitment. And if you're lucky enough to work with someone who's willing to work with you over that time period, it will get easier. It's just taking that plunge initially, and just treat it as a journey and have fun with it. That's really the thing. Enjoy it.
Yeah. Great tips. Thank you so much. I look forward to being on your podcast.
Absolutely.
So you guys, if you're listening, definitely subscribe to his podcast. Lots of really good stuff. Really, really good stuff. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Have a great one.
Great one. All right, guys, I hope you loved that episode just as much as I did. If you learned anything, if you felt like this was valuable in some way, if you're going to try maybe cooking more, or you're going to try adding foods with probiotics more, anything that you're going to do, if this episode made you take action in any way, or it sparked a light bulb in you, please screenshot the episode, share it on your story, tag me, tag Dr. Esposito, and let us know that this benefited you. We really, really appreciate the feedback. We want to make sure that we're providing valuable information and valuable content. If you are not already subscribed to the Tips with Toni podcast, please subscribe. I release an episode every Monday and every Wednesday. When you subscribe to the podcast, you are the first to know when a new episode comes out. And if you really enjoyed the podcast and you want to leave a positive review and a 5-star rating, especially on Apple Podcast, that would be greatly appreciated. The more positive reviews, the more 5-star ratings I get, the more people are able to find the podcast and then find episodes like this and learn from them, and therefore hopefully that translates into them living a healthier life. So you help me live out my message, and I truly appreciate the support. So thank you again so much for listening. As always, my name is Toni Marinucci. I'm your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time.